My name is Hind Makki. I'm a fellow with the Racial Equity Media Fellowship that IFYC has inaugurated this year in 2020. I'm an anti-racism advocate and an educator with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, a think tank that researches the American Muslim communities. On the day after the election in 2016, I was invited to speak at WBEZ, our local NPR affiliate here in Chicago, to discuss essentially the day after the election. And I, as well as the reporters and the other panelists, were a little bit in shock. And honestly, 4 years later, what I can tell you that I remember most, that I kept repeating, was the institutions of our country are strong. The institutions of this country are strong. And you know, I got a little bit of pushback, but I kept repeating that almost as a mantra to myself and to the listeners. And I remembered that mantra 7 days after the inauguration on January 27, 2017, when President Trump signed an executive order that became known as the first Muslim ban. What happened that within hours, hundreds of thousands of Americans poured into our nation's airports in that frigid January night, and they continue to do so, protesting for days. And they managed to convince some judges in states across the country to sue, essentially, and to pause that very first Muslim ban. What I was reminded was that when I was thinking about the institutions of this country, really, I'm thinking about the people who make these institutions, those people who poured into the airports, the judges and the lawyers, and all the people who said, we need to stand up for what we believe is American, and that is a country that welcomes immigrants. These are actually the institutions that I was thinking of. The people are the institutions of this country. And I think that thinking, that reframing of what it means to have an institution in this country is really the guiding light in many ways of how I'm thinking about this conversation this morning. This idea of how can we center racial equity in building an interfaith America the day or in the days after this next election. When we asked you, the participants, the attendees of this morning's discussion, to share some of your thoughts, some of your hopes about either this morning's conversation or the day after the November election, some of the responses we received I'd like to share with you. One was, that we don't let the results of the election divide us further, that we have peace and justice, that no matter the outcome, folks continue to organize and work to hold politicians accountable for real change, that there will be mutual respect for differing points of view and nonviolence, and that we will pivot toward healing and rebuilding. And then about today, that we will be able to learn about coping and managing things after the election to help students or other young people deal with the aftermath of the election. So these are kind of big thoughts. These are big thoughts, and I think that we have the right panel to have a thoughtful conversation around these thoughts. We will not come up with a solution today, but I think that we will be moving toward, inshallah, God willing, a good solution. So let me quickly introduce our panel, and I know that we will have larger or more full bios posted, so please forgive me that I'm not going to be reading all of these wonderful panelists' full bios. But we have Dr. Reverend Zina Jacque, who is the lead pastor of the community church in Barrington, Illinois. With us, we have Pardeep Kaleka, who is the executive director of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee. And we have John Wood Jr., a former nominee for Congress and a former vice chairman of the Republican Party of LA County. And I am really honored to have all three of our wonderful speakers to come and share their wisdom and their thoughts for hope and healing with us this morning. And without further ado, the way we're going to do this, and just very briefly, is that I'm going to start off with asking a question, but do feel free to pose a question in the Q&A box, and I will pull those questions up as well and ask that to our panelists. So without further ado, the first question I really would love to hear your thoughts on, Dr. Zina, John, and Pardeep, is what do you think are the ingredients needed to have this conversation whose goals are to foster healing? And I'm going to ask Dr. Reverend Zina to start us off.
Thank you, Hind, and thank you, IFYC, for this opportunity. How do we hold conversations the day after elections that lead toward healing? There are many ingredients, but there are at least three that I would lift up. The very first one is memory. No matter what happens on that day, for some it will be celebration, for others it may well be despair. But I want us to remember that this is not the only time in our nation that we have faced those twin poles. We as a nation have gone through many, many moments in history when some felt lifted and others in despair, and yet it didn't stop us. I think about my own people as an African-American woman. What was it like when Jim Crow laws were set into place and it looked like all the hopes that had been born after the abolition of slavery were gone? There could have been despair that blocked any growth, but it didn't. It didn't. And so we have to have memory that if we find ourselves in a valley, it's not the first time, it will not be the last time, and that the resilience of the hope of this nation has been borne out over time. We cannot give up. That's not an option. So we have to have memory about how we have come through moments in our past. And I also think we have to have will, the will to have the dialogue. A dialogue in its etymology means through speaking. And unless I'm talking to myself, I have to have the will to have a partner. And in Chicago, there's this amazing project called the Folded Map Project, where Tanika Johnson has taken a map of the city and folded it and created map twins, men and women who live in very different parts of our city, but who've come together to learn about one another. I almost want a folded map project on the day after the election, where somewhere between 30% and 70% of any spectrum you name, because the rabbit ends are not the ones necessarily that are helpful, but somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, you or I find someone, have the will to find someone to begin the conversation of healing. Suspending right and wrong for a moment, because a wound doesn't heal unless you move the irritants and you first wash it clean. So the winning and losing is not going to be helpful in that first conversation. There's a difference in right and wise. We have to have the intention to be wise, to find that dialogue partner and to be in that moment. And the third thing is to sit in that dialogue, is to not run. Because this wound has been building and festering for a long time. The wound of racial inequity, the wound of othering, it's been festering a long time. So no matter after the election, we have to remember we can go forward. We have to find partners, be right, be wise, not right, and be willing to sit in the dialogue long enough for the healing to begin. And you know, if you've had a wound, that massaging it and exercising it is important. And you know, if you've had a wound, in the end, you have a scar. But I would tell us that those scars are badges of courage, because scars don't form on anything that is dead. And if we work together, we'll live, maybe with a scar, but we'll be able to show it as that which kept us in the dialogue at the table.
That's beautiful. Scars are a badge of survival as well. I would love to ask Pardeep to share his thoughts as well on this question.
Sure, and thank you, Hind. Thank you to the Interfaith Youth Corps. It's an honor to be on with Reverend Zina and John. I look forward to the discussion today. I was kind of just reflecting on this as we think about this year and just the difficulty of this year, and just really thinking about three things. I'm going to name them right off the bat: weaponizing understanding, weaponizing compassion, and weaponizing our faiths. Um, I think, and I feel like this year there's been a lot of just weapons of division that have been used against us, and even with feelings. And reflecting on a paper that I just did about, just the comments that came out of the president and the lack of denouncement of the Proud Boys, and wondering what it was that kind of has us feeling this kind of way. And most of the people that I've talked to after that, were just kind of in a place that night, that evening, and that morning, that it felt like a gut punch to a lot of people. And I don't, reflecting on what people expected, what people wanted out of a debate. Did they want some kind of reassurance? Did they want some kind of validation of their feelings? What was it that they wanted? And really thinking about why they felt that way. And often, so before I was with Interfaith, I was a clinician, and I often asked people to trust their feelings. The old saying, like, if we can feel, we can heal. And really trusting your feelings, but having a balanced approach about that. Trusting our intellect, but also having a balanced approach about that. And all of these things kind of existing in this balance. If you overfeel and underthink, well, then you're too emotional without providing reason for it. If you underfeel and overthink, then you're an intellectualizer, and then you start to go off into this place where you're kind of in your head. So I think the reconnection of mind, body, spirit, and really the reconnection with each other takes, and as Reverend Zina said, it takes that internal will to say, how can I reconnect with these feelings without having them be so overwhelming that now I am sort of a servant to my own feelings, and I'm not controlling them, but yet they're controlling me. And that's kind of what I'm seeing right now, is that right now, the politics that exist, our feelings are weaponized against us, not for us. And people are existing in this place, in this feeling. So as we go forward, really the three things that we need to kind of, I think, in my personal opinion, is that we need to start to weaponize understanding. This society has been a hypercritical, judgmental society from birth, right? And how do we get to a place where we're a bit more mindful and understanding and contemplative, rather than reactionary or judgmental? Weaponizing compassion, weaponizing love. I think about, even as we think about some of the movies that were created, and one of the ones that comes out is how big Passion of the Christ was, right? And this movie that talked about, and we all kind of heard of that title, Passion of the Christ. And I've often wondered why it wasn't Compassion of the Christ, or compassion of Jesus. Passion seems to be something that is that's kind of valued, where compassion seems to be something that is undervalued, almost as a sense of weakness, almost a sense of, if a man is compassionate or a woman is compassionate, then somehow, some way, they're going to be taken advantage of. And finally, weaponizing our faiths. And weaponizing our faiths really looks like interfaith collaboration, understanding where we and what the books and the kitab, or the scriptures were saying to us, and not in a sense of thinking that they're all saying the same thing, but the value of each and every one. If we can value the faith and the uniqueness of the faith, then we can value the uniqueness of the person. So.
Thank you for that. A lot of food for thought. I'm going to ask John to also share your thoughts on this question.
Sure. And first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, of course. And I think that so much of what I feel is echoed in Zina and Pardeep's statements, and your own too, Hind. And I think that so much of what ought to ground us in our appreciation of what will be required of us, in particularly in the aftermath of the election, but even in this present moment, is an understanding of the fact that in order for us to be able to sort of summon an expression of American social life that centers around certainly racial equity, but also a broader culture of inclusiveness that I think is able to allow us to sort of cohere and to collaborate socially, politically, and in every other way to the mutual benefit of all of our people, is a perspective that sort of emanates from a holistic understanding of what the human being is in the context of society that incorporates our spiritual and our deeper sort of ethical natures. And so to frame our understanding of what it means to reform society in that way has to be to achieve the balance that Pardeep alluded to. It has to be one that finds a balance between the sort of emotive center and the kind of intellectual um, scaffolding of our beings. It has to be one that looks at the structure of institutions as not simply achieving a sort of stability by being appropriately constructed, but rather that institutions are made viable by the spirit of the human beings that actually compose them, to your point, Hind. And it has to be ultimately something that it has to be a movement of the spirit that is driven by the core virtue of what Martin Luther King Jr. would have described as agape love, which is akin to or equivalent to, in essence, the virtue of goodwill, which Zina, I think it's very much to your starting point. We have to, I think, take advantage of this moment of relative chaos in American life and sort of foreboding with respect to some of the threats that are looming to revisit some very fundamental assumptions in terms of what aspects actually allow us to generate a society that is less of a simple technical, economic, or political union, and that is deeper than those layers, an actual community. Somebody mentioned the concept of etymology, the origin of words, community. It shares a root with the word commune, right? And what that essentially means is for us to come into fellowship with each other and to be of one spirit in interacting with each other around things that we hold sacred. And one thing that we ought to hold sacred is, of course, life and quality of life itself, and the spirit of love that makes life worth living, and how we preserve that, the opportunity for us to love and to pursue happiness, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, um, is by safeguarding our ability to pursue these deeper, more meaningful things in life by working together to facilitate and to strengthen the institutions and the structures of American life that can allow for these things to flourish in the context of our communal relationships. But we can only do that if we start from a place of goodwill and allow goodwill to guide us in the process of genuinely empathizing with one another's experiences, being open minded to the ways in which our own advantages in life may put us, on the one hand, in a position to where perhaps we are blind to the struggles of others and have opportunity to learn, but on the other hand, we are given the opportunity to experience the fulfillment of using our advantages in life to be able to uplift other people. And the one thing I would add to that is that while there are certain ways in which the kind of distribution of privilege and power in our society may seem to place that particular onus on certain groups and certain contexts in a more predictable fashion, we all of us do have power, regardless of where we are starting from in terms of the origins of our life and our identity and our experience. And therefore, we all do have something to contribute to the work of raising up a society that is strong in the edifice of justice, but motivated by the fire of love and goodwill in a way that can make society, again, inclusive, I think, in a way that honors all people. And so looking holistically at what the human being is and imagining the work of social reform through that lens, through a spiritual lens that is tied closely to this ethos of love and goodwill and nonviolence. To me, that is the philosophical reframing that must begin. And I'm pleased and honored and blessed to be a part of a conversation that I think is aimed towards just that.
Likewise, I feel like I'm the luckiest person in the panel today because I get to ask you all the questions that I want to find the answers to, or to have, to be able to reframe the way I'm thinking about them, and you all are helping me do that. And I want to remind the audience as well, you can also be as lucky as me and also pose some of your questions. I wanted to maybe unpack or tease out a couple of the things that you mentioned, John, in this next portion of this conversation, when you uplift the fact that we should start from a place of goodwill, right? And for me, I have in my social circle, in my friend circle, I have a lot of people who are preachers and teachers, and almost all of them are saying that, even keeping in mind, of course, not just the election, not just the pandemic, not, but also the unrest of the summer. And it's not even true to even say the unrest of the summer, because it's continuing to this day, right? Starting from the police shooting of George Floyd in Minneapolis and continuing. And so sometimes it's very hard to bridge that divide when you have preachers and teachers saying we should start from a place of goodwill. We should think about how we can summon an expression of American social life centered on inclusion and cohesion, to use your words, John. But I would love for the three of you to share with us, what do you think the role of faith communities, and particularly the interfaith community, including people of no faith at all? So in all of the diversity of the United States, really, what role do we have in developing the space of catharsis for the community, for the country, so that we can even get to that place where we can start from a place of goodwill? And I'm going to maybe switch it up and ask Pardeep to begin and share your thoughts on this question.
Sure, and Hind, I feel very blessed to be part of this discussion as well, and just to, just to kind of absorb everything. So as important as I think it is, like that I have a reply to this answer, I can't wait for Reverend Zina, yourself, and John to talk again. So I'll, I think for us, again, just talking about the difficulty of this year, we've been forced to kind of humble ourselves and think about really the frailness of our existence. And again, we'll eventually come out of this season. However, if we don't learn from what the creative spirit is trying to teach us in this moment, then we as a species will have severed not only our connection with one another, but we will have severed our connection with our relationship with this earth. And shortly after, we saw that after COVID-19 was causing people to not be able to breathe, the air in very polluted countries was able to kind of lift, and so there was this relationship of human beings not being able to breathe while the earth was being able to breathe better, and so that severance of the, what does our relationship to the earth look like? This simple prayer that I have is that we trust the visions and the dangers that the Creator is trying and attempt to show us. We come together and reconnect in the spirit and the spiritual purpose that God is attempting to manifest and show us. And so when I'm thinking about, like, I guess, the goodwill, one of the conversations that I have with my children early on is, I ask them, do they feel alone? And then to kind of center themselves and ask them, are you really alone, or is there someone that's kind of always with you? And I think that part of faith, just being able to give faith, and then sometimes we, as communities of faith, one of the things that I don't like hearing is that we as communities of faith, because it's almost like a psychological sabotaging of exclusion of who is not a person of faith, who is not a spiritual person, who is not a person on a journey of finding that will, finding that, and good can be a journey, and it probably is a journey. Like, when are we good or good enough? So I think for us, we need to, for one, we need to kind of be outside of our sanctuary walls. And I think we also, those that do subscribe by a certain religion, or need to kind of be outside of our psychological walls and start to embrace everybody's faith journey and say, okay, what makes you a better person? How do you become more open? How do you become more inclusive? So I think all of that is just part of the soup that we're trying to navigate as we go forward.
Thank you for that. Reverend Zina, if I can ask you to share your thoughts as well.
Pardeep, I so appreciate the challenge to go out from, and I agree wholeheartedly. And I want to go out knowing better what I do believe. And so I think there is at least in my circles as an American Baptist pastor, I want to challenge my folks to be sure they know what they believe. I had a life-changing moment in my living room with my 7-year-old granddaughter. She's not from a family that actively participates in faith. And when she comes to hang out with me, we do some things a little differently. And we were studying some children's stories together, sitting on the family room floor. And it was the story of Jesus talking about being gracious and kind to your enemies. And so I asked this little child who happens to be biracial, tell me who your enemies are. And she named her friends. And so we then talked about what made enemies, and we worked on, things they had in common, and could they sit down and share their American Girl dolls. And so she headed back to Florida with a plan, to sit with these two enemies. The next time she was here for her grandfather's birthday, in the backyard, there were these discussions about the pandemic and about racial unrest and about injustice. This 7-year-old at the table said, "Well, I thought you all were supposed to love each other. Grandma Z, you told me all about," and she repeated what I had said to her about going back and being brave and sit down with your friends and find what you have. With her hands on her imaginary hips, she challenged us. It was silent. And so I want what I thought I was transferring to this 7-year-old to be the dialogue internally first. Years ago, there was that, what would Jesus do? That's not helpful to me. What did Jesus do is very helpful to me. He crossed boundaries. He forgave. He stood in the heat of the dialogue and spoke with love. And he talked to us about what, to your choice of words, John, agape love. In the biblical writ, there are 7 or 8 different kinds of love. But agape love is this robust, unconditional love. What a Tupac song about unconditional love. There's always something growing inside of me, and don't forget, it's going to be dark, but it's not the end. We, in our faith circles, have to get clear about what we believe and take it out with humility. Because if you are Christian, I don't care how you read the text. I don't care how you hold the words that are in red. The one we claim to follow, if you're Christian, said, everything else hangs on these 2 things: love God and your neighbor. All the law and the prophets, he said, hang on this. If that's my standard, like my granddaughter reminded me, then I enter the world humbly. I enter the world looking for ways to share that love. What did Jesus do? He entered the world in a way that embraced and included even enemies. So I want to be clear that this little tribe I'm a part of gets that right, so that we then go out and look for those intersections where that agape love can find a partner and where we can learn from one another. And there's one other thing I want to say. I don't want to be afraid of being broken open. In the Hebrew scriptures, Micah talks about life beginning when, in the second chapter, when things are broken open, and when things are broken open, the leader will rise up and go forward. We learn in the Gospels that light breaks open darkness. And in this faith tribe, the greatest breaking open was of the tomb and the resurrection. Nothing happens unless something is broken open. So I can't, in the chaos that's around us, I can't be afraid of the breaking open. Even my heart, especially my heart, because that's what my granddaughter did to us out in the backyard. She broke open the conversation. And it's in that breaking that new beginnings occur. COVID has broken us open. Pardeep, you are right. May we not lose those lessons. So I want to call to our individual communities to be sure we have drunk long and hard and deeply of those values we profess, and then take it out as a vessel full to share with those we meet, and sit at the table and share that as we are broken open, knowing that that's where the beginning of healing, where that beginning occurs.
Thank you so much for that, and for uplifting the fact that, you know, changes don't cause breaks, they don't cause ruptures, but actually ruptures are the cause of the change. And it's up to us as the people, as society, and the people who inhabit the institutions to create positive change, and change that is inclusive of everyone, regardless of racial background, political persuasion, gender orientation, that everyone who is on this land deserves to be treated with, as we believe, I think all of us, in the golden rule, right? To be treating others as you wish to be treated yourself. And it also reminds me of the verses attributed to Rumi, which is that the wound is where the light enters, right? And so I think it's really important that even though so many of us are finding this year to be very difficult, and it is a difficult year for so many reasons, you know, environmental disaster in the West, and the pandemic, and the racial unrest, and all the rest of it, this also can be an opportunity to create a space for agape love, if I may be bold to appropriate that for my Christian sisters and brothers. If I can ask John to share your thoughts as well on this question. I'm really eager to hear your perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could start by just making a little bit more biographical reference to myself. You know, and you mentioned some of the highlights from my early political career. I'm from a family that is biracial and bipartisan, actually very much multicultural and bipartisan. My mother is a liberal Black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father's a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. He comes from a very wealthy family. My mother comes from a family that's much more modest economically. And I grew up, and Zina, your story about your granddaughter just tickles me to no end, in part because I feel like I know her, because I've got so many little cousins and kids in my family who who are like that. And I was sort of that kid too, in my own way at one time. My parents are also from different generations, and one of my earlier memories in life, they argued a lot growing up. They fought pretty fiercely, and they didn't stay together too long. They separated when I was fairly young, and I can remember them screaming at each other in the living room, and me at the age of 5 or so, sort of running to stand between them and putting my hands out in each direction, saying, "Please stop screaming at each other," you know. And what I felt at that time, what I later realized I carried with me through life, was this conviction that these two people from very different worlds were human beings that I loved and saw immense wisdom and value and gifts of spirit in. And I felt like the the divinity in my parents and the sort of different sides of my family was very clear to me, in part because it made up who I was, and yet they had difficulty oftentimes seeing that in one another, at least in particular moments. And so today I work with an organization. I'm a national ambassador for a group called Braver Angels, which is it's a national bipartisan organization, the largest of its kind, and we foster dialogue and community building across the political and across the racial spectrum. And I only mention that because you asked this question: what is it that faith groups can do to help create the space for catharsis? Which presupposes the idea that we need a catharsis in our society, which we do. I agree. That's what we seek to do in our work at Braver Angels. But I do think that there's some particular role that communities of faith have in creating the larger social context for this to occur. And one simple observation of an aspect of that is the fact that I believe that without our and this applies to us even if we are not sort of actively religious or anything like that. But I think that there is such a thing as wisdom tradition and moral tradition and spiritual practices that are anchored in long stretches of human history. And I think that there is a vocabulary of the spirit that, even if you do not adopt one particular interpretation or another of a religious doctrine, comes to us as gifts from our ancestry that allow us to be able to speak to parts of the human being and to parts of the human soul individually and collectively that are not available to us if our vernacular is limited merely to the political and merely to the sociological. And so, one of the great complaints that many people have about our current time in American life is that there seems to be very little room in the way we talk about spirituality reconciliation and for grace. And so, in the spiritual tradition that I would call myself a part of, and about myself, I would say my mother is very much sort of a mystic in her orientation. I was raised with that in my background. I considered myself to be an agnostic until about the age of 20 or so, and I started studying metaphysical philosophy and New Age spirituality, and came to a certain version of Christianity. But I'm still on my journey, right? Our spiritual selves have to transcend the labels that might be applied to them, because otherwise we get a thin notion of what our religious characters actually are. Whatever I am in terms of my religious identity, it's said more by what I do and how I express myself than whatever label you might put upon me, I should hope. But I think that the idea of salvation has to bring with it much more than this idea that you have a theological opinion, but rather this idea that by embracing this idea that we really are created from love, that we have the internal permission to release not just hatred, but fear and doubt with respect to our relationships with our fellow man. Because if we can do that, if we can operate from a point of seeing the divinity in one another, past the sin, past the ignorance, past the mistakes, then we give ourselves permission to speak to those parts of the human spirit that lie beyond our social or political ignorance. And if we can do that, we begin to harness the power of nonviolence that Dr. King identified. this ability for us to speak to the conscience of the opposition in a way that says that I am speaking truth to power, but I am also speaking truth not just to win justice for my side, but to create a beloved community that includes you as well. And so if we can demonstrate to one another, to take it back to Zina's point, that we are not ultimately enemies. We may be opponents in our temporal context. We may be at odds with each other in the immediate context of our politics, etc. But in the grand scope of God's design, we are all placed here with the purpose in a conspiracy of sorts that is meant to move us to a place of grace and abundance shared between all. If we can engage each other from that consciousness, we can speak to each other in the parts of our beings that resonate with those realities. And that has definite implications for the way in which our institutions evolve. If communities of faith can create the space for that sort of connection to take place and for catharsis to flower up in those spaces, then that becomes the cultural norm around which our politics, our economy, and the other structures of our material society begin to develop and emerge. And so if we can begin to set that pattern forth here, and we're not beginning anything, because even this conversation is a continuation of efforts that we have all been a part of and inherited from those who have come before us, then we advance the cause of the beloved community and of a divine society that much further and that much quicker, I do believe.
Hind, if I can follow up on something John said, that is so beautiful, because imagine if circles of people, whether they're engaged in households of faith or in these spiritual communities, really said that human life is precious, not just in the womb, but all of human life is precious, that no human life should be denied the basics. And there was a groundswell of that belief. You would not have immigration policies such as we have. You would not have school funding such that we have. If all human life were positive 3 weeks into the COVID experience, when disproportionate numbers of Black and brown people were dying, those faith communities would have said all life is precious. If we had that groundswell from spiritual circles and circles that call themselves households of faith, and that was the accountability line. That was the voice that spoke into the structures we hold so dear in this nation, across every division. Imagine how we could call to account our structures. They are ours. They exist to serve us. But we have allowed small gains to divide us. We have allowed the daily win to divide us. My granddaddy was a farmer in Northeast Mississippi, and he taught me the difference in short time and long time. Long time is you plant a seed and you don't know when it's going to harvest, but you take care of it because that's food for your family and succor for the community. Short time is you eat an apple because you've got it, you know what it is, you eat it, it's done. We have moved into nothing but short time, immediate wins, immediate victories. We have got, and love is long time. Love is long time, agape love. So our faith institutions have to be willing to stop playing by the culture's rules of short time and to recognize we operate in eternity and live that way. But we, the faith institutions, have sold out to the culture's ways of measuring things. So we have to be called accountable. But that when I hear John talking about this, I just saw wave after wave of voices from faith communities calling our processes, our institutions into account. But we have to be ready to do that. And we have seeded that ground, and we must take it back.
Yes, thank you so much. You know, we have a couple of questions that arose in the Q&A box, and I have a question that I'm going to selfishly. This is what I'm going to do. Essentially, I'm going to merge these three questions and then ask each of you to share like 2 minutes each, and then we can close out. And so essentially these are the questions. Kaylee or Callie, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, asks, when you're thinking about issues like police brutality and inhuman ICE practices, how do you work for justice and move with compassion when people with power are defending and trying to uphold policies that fundamentally harm others? So keeping that in mind, David asks, it often seems like people of goodwill must struggle twice, once for their own convictions and a second time for the rights of all. And too often it seems like some people are only fighting for themselves. Is this right? How can we move forward, rebuilding civility and democracy, even as we advocate for our convictions? And then my thought is actually, as we merge these two questions, I would really love to hear your thoughts on how we can move beyond the everyday, the day-to-day, the immediacy, even, if you will, the smallness of some of our everyday conversations, and to have a bigger conversation, to get to the broader impact that our day-to-day conversations, and I don't mean to belittle them when I say that they're small, how that impacts the country in the future. So these are three huge questions that I'm asking you all to fit within the time frame of 2 minutes each. But I would really, I felt like all of them were really important. And since I'm the moderator, I get to ask my question. So I'm going to ask Pardeep to start us out again and continue.
Thank you, Hind, and thank you everyone that's out there and asking these. I mean, these are really great questions, and so I was a police officer for 5 years in one of the roughest parts of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There is a slew of historical injustices that have been committed systemically, and I did that for about 5 years until I became an educator, and I did that for about 10 years. And my sort of introduction into the faith world came after a shooting that killed 7 people, one of them being my father and temple president at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin in Oak Creek. And that was, I've sort of had an antagonistic relationship with faith my entire life until that happened. And then I started to see something a little bit differently. And what I saw differently, and after that, I reached out to the guy that started the organization that shot, that the shooter belonged to. I won't name the organization, but I reached out to him. He was a former white supremacist, and I sat down with him and asked him why. Why do people do these types of things? And he simply said to me, hurt people or hurt themselves. And I didn't think that pain was, at that time, I just kind of thought about that and reflected on our society and really how much of our society is hurting, needs a catharsis, both externally and internally. And my journey going forward and what that looked like. And oftentimes compassion was something that kept coming up. What does compassion have to do with a white supremacist killing 7 people? What does compassion have to do with the systemic ills of society? What does it have to do with me policing? What is it like? And love kept coming up, and forgiveness kept coming up. All of these things kept coming up, and then I sat and I sat with the tension of, could I forgive this person? Could I really, really, genuinely, from my heart, not just saying it, but could I truly forgive this person? And I thought about a lot of things, and one of the passages that kept coming up was Luke 23:24. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. As Jesus is on the cross, and the soldiers are tearing up his clothes and his garments, and as society is tearing up and dividing themselves within all of these garments, and thinking about forgiveness and compassion not being part of that recipe of healing is just a scary thought. And as we went forward, and the solution, I again, this is my personal opinion, but I know the solution is that we need to embody that light. And we talked about Rumi, and the wound is where the light enters. right? And that light for me honestly entered at that time and said, you need to forgive the shooter and genuinely forgive. And what happened to me was this gratitude that I had towards life, this gratefulness that I had towards my relationships, our community, my own personal children. And that I think that I took things for granted before that. And this made me cherish life and embody it. And what it did for me was not just give me compassion for the world, but compassion for myself and my own children. And I found myself being a better father and a better husband and a better community member. And we all need to come back to what we can do personally within our own personal lives and know that compassion has to be part of that recipe as we go forward and we fight police brutality, we fight um, immigration policies that are unfair, all of these things. Because if you don't do that, if you're not compassionate towards self, you will not be able to embody that light long enough and you will burn out. And so I tell you that from just personal experience, we need you to embody that light and stay with it.
Thank you so much for, these are really powerful and beautiful, beautiful words. Thank you, Pardeep. John, if I can also ask you to share about 2 minutes or so, your response to this question.
Sure. One of the main things that I tend to talk about in the context of my work is the non-contradiction between, on the one hand, passionately advocating for the things that you believe in and consider urgent politically, supporting the candidate that you are going to vote for, supporting the causes and the policy changes and the structural reforms that you see as necessary for justice and equity, etc. I try to emphasize the non-contradiction between advocating for those things in politics on the one hand, and on the other hand, building out the fabric of our relationships in this country with another through that spirit of goodwill, love, and empathy that we've talked a bit about here. But it's worth noting why it is these things feel like contradictions, because part of what motivates us towards justice is not just idealism, but a reaction to the pain that we are feeling. And as Pardeep has said, hurt people. And that's not to say that pain is not a justifiable motivation for seeking progress. It certainly is. But it must be something, it must be a fire that is channeled in a direction that ultimately feeds our ability to wield moral force as opposed to the force of mere condemnation. And sometimes that's what happens to us. We can ourselves be innocent victims of a certain circumstance in society, but because we take hatred in, we return that. And even if we're doing it in a politically understandable cause, it doesn't mean that the effects of that sort of spirit in our actions don't ultimately run counter to the world that we're trying to build. If, on the other hand, in our communities, in our spiritual practices, we are able to center ourselves in a place of grace on the inside, then we can find a way to wield that moral and spiritual power in our activism, in our politics, while doing so in a way that still allows us to speak to the conscious center of the people who we are trying to change, so that we can create the sorts of coalitions that can ultimately yield the fruits of a society that is reborn. And so just one real quick observation: there are two goods that we are aiming for in the context of our striving. The first good is the sort of change that we want to see in society on a material level that can make our society more open to equity. And that's an important gain. But the second gain is perhaps even more profound, and it's what makes the first the thing that can endure, which is the gain on the inside of being able to feel justified by the Spirit of God, if you will, who speaks through your conscience and who rewards you in your heart, even as you suffer, for abiding in a spirit of love. That is its own reward. And if you feel that reward within yourself, you feel the strength necessary to endure in everything else that you do. Because ultimately, the world changes around what is in your heart. So if you can stay centered in that, then all of those other things will come into a line.
In the biblical text, whenever you read the word in the Greek scriptures, whenever you read the word compassion, this is an inelegant way of describing it, but it means your bowels are gripped such that you have to go. That's what that word, think Thanksgiving dinner, right? You have no choice. You have no choice. You have to go. The Greek word is splagnagozomai. That's what it means. So when the questioner, Kaylee, when you ask about how you move with compassion, those two things are together. You move, and you move, and to John's beautiful words, you move in the coalition. You move with others of like mind. And I want to try and tie that to the question David asked, because too often we are willing to suffer alone. And when he talks about people fighting for their own needs and then fighting for the group needs, I think centers of faith and spirituality are meant to be the places where people come and seek support for their needs. And then we who are in those centers recognize what the trends and the streams are, and we build up the coalitions with together, not alone, not as some leader, power over, power with, power together. But we hear it from so many sides. So these two things go together in my mind, because if there's a center where people are safe, where they know they'll be heard, where they know that they will not be judged, where their needs can come pouring forth, we can gather that strength, and then with that compassion, be forced to move forward. I want us to not forget that it is the many who gather and who carry the movement forward. There may be a thin tip of the arrow who starts the process, but the progress is made as we go forward together. Don't you get weary in doing good. And the way to not get weary in doing good is on the day that I give up, Pardeep comes alongside me and holds up my right arm, and John holds up my left arm. And on the day they're weary, that's my job. That's why we can't do this alone. That's why we can't have these false barriers dividing us, because we need one another so we can sing together, don't you get weary.
Thank you so much for that. Apologies, I had some strange technical difficulties at the very end. But I did want to thank Dr. Reverend Zina Jacque, John Wood Jr., and Pardeep Kaleka for this beautiful conversation. Before handing it off to Becca and Ashley, I just wanted to say that, you know, we've been sort of dropping poetry and verse and psalms throughout. And you know, one of the verses that came to my mind as we were having this conversation, throughout the conversation, was a few words by Hafiz, another famous Persian poet, you know, who reminds us that even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, "You owe me." Look what happens with a love like that. It lights the whole sky. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists. I thought that this was a very enlightening in all senses of that word, and beautiful, enriching conversation. I'd like to hand it over to IFYC to close us out. Thank you again.